My mother-in-law had just made her position clear, and the words were still ringing in my ears. Anyone who doesn't help with housework isn't welcome here. She said it with a tone that made it obvious. She expected me to feel guilty, maybe even beg for forgiveness. As she sat there, confident in her authority, my husband, John, was beside her, a slight smirk tugging at his lips. He was clearly enjoying the spectacle, happy to see me being put in my place. But instead of feeling upset or ashamed as they intended, a sense of calm washed over me. I wasn't angry or hurt. In fact, I felt strangely liberated. I stood up and, with a firm voice, said, "I'll leave then." There wasn't a hint of hesitation in my voice. In that moment, it became clear to me. They should regret their behavior, not me. I'm Susan, 42 years old, and I've been married to John for more than 2 decades. We have 2 grown-up kids who have both moved out and are living independently now. After years of raising a family and juggling full-time work, I thought John and I would finally have some time to enjoy our lives together, just the 2 of us. But that dream quickly faded when John's mother, my mother-in-law, came to live with us after her husband passed away. At first, I thought we could make it work. After all, John and I had always shared responsibilities, especially when the kids were younger. He used to help with housework and cooking, and we raised our children together as a team. But things began to change the moment my mother-in-law moved in. Living with her turned out to be more challenging than I had anticipated. My job keeps me busy, and I often work late into the evening, not getting home until after 8 p.m. However, whenever I arrive home, I'm met with chaos. The living room is usually a disaster. Snacks and clothes strewn all over the place, dishes left undone. My husband is always there, sitting on the sofa with a beer in his hand, watching TV as if the mess around him doesn't exist. He never acknowledges me when I come in. No hello, or how was your day? Just silence and the noise from the television. Dinner is never prepared when I get home, and no one seems to care. My husband just sits there waiting, like he's the king of the castle. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law, who spends her days lounging around, never lifts a finger to help. It's frustrating, to say the least, but I've become accustomed to the disappointment. Ignoring the mess, I go straight to the kitchen to start making dinner. It's something I've grown used to doing despite the exhaustion that comes from a long day at work. As I'm prepping the meal, my mother-in-law usually emerges from her room. She doesn't offer to help, of course. Instead, she stands in the doorway, arms crossed, and starts lecturing me. "You're back late again," she begins, her voice dripping with criticism. "I'm starving. You're always talking about your job, but you never take care of this house. What kind of homemaker are you?" Her words sting every time, but I've learned to let them roll off my back. It's easier that way. If I argue or try to defend myself, it only makes things worse. Instead, I just nod and pretend to listen while focusing on making dinner. I know her complaints will eventually taper off once she's had her say. She accuses me of not being a good wife or a responsible homemaker, completely ignoring the fact that I work full-time and contribute just as much, if not more, to the household finances. What hurts even more than her constant nitpicking is my husband's reaction, or rather, his lack of one. He sits there, saying nothing, but I can tell he's enjoying the fact that I'm being scolded. It's like he gets some twisted satisfaction from seeing me put in my place. Women should appreciate their husbands more. My mother-in-law says one evening, as we sit down for dinner, "Susan, you lack charm. You don't respect your husband the way you should." That's right. My husband chimes in laughing. "Susan, you've got a lot to learn." Their words fill me with anger, but I bite my tongue. It's becoming a daily routine. Me cooking, them criticizing, and my husband playing along, feeding into his mother's complaints. Despite my repeated pleas for them to start dinner, without me when I'm working late, they never listen. Even when I come home exhausted and immediately start cooking, they just sit there, waiting for me to serve the meal like I'm their personal maid. Things weren't always this way. Before my mother-in-law moved in, John used to be a helpful and supportive husband. He took care of the kids, cooked meals when I worked late, and we managed the household together. But since she moved in, everything has changed. Now, he's joined her in criticizing me, acting as if I'm the one who's failing at everything. It's disorienting and frustrating to see how much he's changed in such a short amount of time. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law contributes nothing to our household expenses. When her husband passed away, she inherited a decent sum of money, but instead of saving or investing it, she blew it all on expensive, frivolous items. Now, she's living with us for free, and we're expected to shoulder the burden of her financial irresponsibility. She even accumulated debt, and instead of paying it off, she let it pile up until she had no choice but to rely on us. I'll never forget the first day she moved in. She bowed deeply to me, thanking me for allowing her to stay with us and promising to be considerate. I thought things might go smoothly, but it took only 3 days for her to start complaining again. Her criticisms began small. Comments about how I didn't clean enough or how I wasn't attentive to John's needs. But they quickly escalated. Her main issue is that I work full-time. She's made it clear that she believes a good wife should be at home, taking care of the house and cooking meals. She even suggested that I quit my job and take a part-time position at a local supermarket. I tried to explain to her that my job is important and that quitting would hurt our finances, but she refused to listen. Instead, she just kept insisting that I wasn't fulfilling my duties as a wife. Every day brings a new complaint. She doesn't like the meals I make, so dinner has become the biggest battleground. She insists that we eat dinner at 6 p.m. sharp, with at least 3 side dishes, and that we all sit together as a family. But with my job, it's impossible for me to be home that early. Still, she continues to complain about how I'm neglecting my duties. When I try to explain that quitting my job isn't an option, she insinuates that it must be because John's salary isn't enough, blaming me for not appreciating his hard work. When I look to John for support, he just shrugs it off. "You'll learn your lesson eventually," he says, completely dismissing my concerns. It's infuriating. He plays the role of the tolerant husband who puts up with his wife's supposed shortcomings, and it only fuels my mother-in-law's disdain for me. Every day, the tension grows, but after my mother-in-law's ultimatum, I've made up my mind. I'm no longer willing to endure their criticism in silence. If they want me gone, I'll leave. I won't stay in a home where I'm disrespected and taken for granted. The only people who should regret their actions are them. You've been facing a difficult and unfair situation at home involving your husband and mother-in-law. When your mother-in-law moved in, things took a drastic turn. Previously, you and your husband had a good relationship and were able to manage household responsibilities between the two of you. However, after her arrival, your mother-in-law began interfering, particularly when it came to housework. She insisted that as a wife, it was solely your job to take care of all household chores, and whenever you tried to get your husband to help, she would intervene and discourage him. Unfortunately, your husband didn't stand up for you or defend you, and this was deeply disappointing. In fact, you noticed something troubling. Your husband would smirk whenever his mother criticized you, which made you suspect that he was actually enjoying the situation. You started to wonder if your husband had issues with the fact that you earned more than him and possibly resented being asked to do housework. He might have felt conflicted because he was supposed to be the provider, but since you contributed more financially, he couldn't complain openly. This led to the troubling realization that he might have been taking pleasure in seeing you struggle under his mother's criticism. Things became even worse as your mother-in-law began openly questioning your husband's role as the head of the family. Her behavior seemed to give your husband some kind of satisfaction, as though he was silently enjoying watching you being scolded. This was heartbreaking for you because it revealed a narrow-minded side of your husband that you hadn't noticed before. You started to feel stuck, unsure of how to handle the situation, especially since your husband wasn't offering you any support. Over time, your mother-in-law continued to stir up trouble, and things escalated when a neighbor confronted you while you were out shopping. The neighbor told you that you should be more considerate of your mother-in-law, which caught you off guard. When you asked what she meant, she revealed that your mother-in-law had been telling people that you were a terrible daughter-in-law who didn't do any housework, kept the house dirty, let the laundry pile up, and fed the family only bread for meals. According to her, your mother-in-law's health was declining because she had to do all the chores herself, and your husband was forced to work late because of the state of the household. You were stunned and hurt to hear how she was portraying you, knowing that none of it was true. You realized that your mother-in-law had been spreading these lies in the neighborhood, painting herself as a helpless victim and you as a lazy, inconsiderate daughter-in-law. This led to people in the neighborhood looking at you with judgment and disdain, and you felt ashamed that your personal family issues were now public gossip. When you confronted your mother-in-law about the rumors, she merely laughed and brushed it off, saying that it was true. This infuriated you, and something inside you snapped. You decided that if she wanted to accuse you of being a bad daughter-in-law who didn't do any housework, you would stop doing the chores altogether. From that point on, you made a conscious decision to stop doing anything for her. You only cooked for yourself and took care of your own needs. When your mother-in-law demanded dinner the next evening, you ignored her and made a cup of instant noodles just for yourself. Her reaction was to yell and call you the worst daughter-in-law, but you stayed calm and continued eating. When your husband finally confronted you about it, you explained how his mother had been spreading lies about you and that you were done trying to please her. Your husband tried to downplay the situation, saying that his mother probably exaggerated, and urged you not to be stubborn. However, you were too exhausted and hurt to argue. You simply ignored him and continued focusing on yourself. You realized that no matter how much housework you did, you would always be seen as a bad wife in your mother-in-law's eyes. So, from then on, you stopped doing chores entirely. Your mother-in-law continued to complain, especially about breakfast, but you stood your ground. You told her that she could either take care of herself or pay for her food, as you were no longer willing to cater to her demands. Even though you felt a bit guilty for being so blunt, you believed it was necessary given how she had been treating you. Things escalated even further when one day, a group of your mother-in-law's elderly siblings and their spouses showed up at your door. They had all heard the exaggerated stories your mother-in-law had been telling, claiming that you were mistreating her, not feeding her properly, and not letting her take a bath. They were there to confront you and defend her, believing her version of events without even hearing your side of the story. You found yourself in an unbearable and hostile environment at home, surrounded by people who treated you unfairly. It all started when your mother-in-law moved in with you and your husband. What once was a happy and peaceful marriage quickly became strained due to her constant interference and manipulation. She began to criticize you relentlessly, particularly when it came to housework. According to her, it was your sole responsibility as a wife to handle all of the household chores, and every time you tried to get your husband to help, she would intervene, stopping him from doing anything. Worse still, your husband never defended you or stood up for you. Over time, you noticed that he would even smirk when his mother scolded you, leading you to suspect that he might be enjoying the situation. This behavior made you question your husband's true character. You began to wonder if he had a problem with the fact that you earned more than him, or if he resented the idea of doing housework because it clashed with traditional gender roles. Your suspicions deepened as your mother-in-law started to question his authority as the head of the family. Strangely, it seemed that her criticisms gave your husband a sense of satisfaction, as if he was silently happy to see you belittled. The more you thought about it, the more you realized that your husband wasn't the kind and supportive man you thought he was. Instead, he was weak, easily swayed by the opinions of others, especially his overbearing mother. His failure to stand up for you when you needed him the most broke your heart, and your affection for him began to fade. The situation worsened when you learned that your mother-in-law had been spreading malicious lies about you to your neighbors, portraying you as a lazy and neglectful daughter-in-law who didn't do any housework, let the house fall into disrepair, and only fed the family bread for meals. One day, a neighbor confronted you about your supposed behavior, and you were shocked to hear how your mother-in-law had been misrepresenting you to others. You tried to defend yourself, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. People in the neighborhood were now looking at you with judgment and disdain, all because of your mother-in-law's lies. When you confronted her about it, she laughed in your face and insisted that what she was saying was true. This was the final straw for you. You realized that no matter what you did, you would always be the bad guy in her eyes. So, you made a bold decision. If she was going to accuse you of being a bad daughter-in-law who did nothing, then you would stop doing anything at all. From that moment on, you refused to do any housework. You only cooked for yourself, and you ignored your mother-in-law's constant demands for meals and chores. When your husband finally tried to intervene, you explained to him that you were done trying to please someone who was determined to paint you as the villain. He tried to downplay the situation, urging you not to be stubborn, but you had had enough. You realized that your husband would never be on your side, and you stopped caring about what either of them thought. From then on, you focused on taking care of yourself. However, things took an even darker turn when your mother-in-law's siblings, 9 elderly people, showed up at your door, accusing you of being a demon wife who deserved punishment. They had all heard your mother-in-law's exaggerated and false stories about how you were mistreating her, and they had come to confront you. As they berated you, one of her brothers banged the floor with his cane, shouting at you to stop making excuses and demanding that you apologize and reflect on your actions. You were overwhelmed, breaking out in a cold sweat from the fear and pressure of being attacked by so many people. Your husband arrived in the middle of the confrontation, but instead of defending you, he sided with his family and criticized you as well. Any affection you had left for him vanished in that moment. You realized that he was not kind, but weak, unable to stand up to pressure and easily swayed by the opinions of others. One of your mother-in-law's brothers even suggested that you and your husband should get a divorce, and everyone in the room agreed. Your mother-in-law tried to offer you a humiliating deal. If you promised to change your ways and serve her and your husband better, they might give you another chance. Her siblings told you that you should be grateful for having such a kind mother-in-law and warned that you wouldn't find anyone better. They even decided that they would take turns visiting your home each week to check if you were doing the chores and taking care of your husband and mother-in-law. It was an absurd and demeaning proposition, but the group seemed satisfied with their decision. Before leaving, they all planned to go out for sushi, and as they walked out the door, your mother-in-law gave you one last command to have the house cleaned and the laundry done by the time they got back. You were left alone in the messy living room, tears streaming down your face as the weight of the situation crashed over you. You couldn't understand why things had come to this. You had tried your best to be a good wife and daughter-in-law, but none of it mattered. Despite everything you had done, you were being criticized and vilified by everyone around you. When your husband and mother-in-law returned home later that evening, your mother-in-law, tipsy from their sushi outing, sneered at you, demanding that you leave the house since you were a wife who didn't do any housework. Your husband joined in, smirking as if he expected you to obey them without question. But you had reached your breaking point. Calmly, you told them that you would leave, and you went to pack your things. They thought you were bluffing, but you didn't care about their reactions anymore. You packed your belongings and walked out of the house, leaving them behind without a word. 2 weeks later, your mother-in-law called you, frantic. She said that your husband had no money and asked what was going on. You calmly told her the truth. Your husband only earned a third of what you did, and you had been covering most of the household expenses. You also reminded her that the house was in your name and informed her that you planned to sell it, so she and your husband would need to move out soon. Your mother-in-law was stunned by the news and started to panic, begging you to come back and apologizing for everything. But it was too late. You had already decided to divorce your husband, and you told her that everything would be handled through a lawyer. You hung up the phone, ignoring her tearful apologies. With the help of a lawyer, you filed for divorce, citing the toxic behavior of your husband and mother-in-law as the reason. The divorce was granted, and you even received a small consolation payment. When you told your children about the divorce and explained what had happened, they fully supported your decision, agreeing that your husband and mother-in-law were at fault. After the divorce, you sold the house, and your husband and mother-in-law were forced to move out. They had to stay with relatives for a while, But soon enough, the truth about their behavior came out, and they were rejected by their own family. Now, they live together in a small apartment, struggling financially because of your husband's low salary. They spend their days blaming each other for your departure, and your husband frequently messages you, begging for reconciliation. He claims that he has cut ties with his mother and wants to make things right, but you have no interest in going back. You are considering blocking him entirely because his messages have become bothersome. Without their constant nagging and manipulation, you finally feel free. You are no longer burdened by the toxic environment they created, and you plan to live your life on your own terms, focusing on yourself and finding happiness in your independence.